this episode of I Fight with What You Fear with Richard Vega. Today, I have a wonderful guest. His name is Marco Roberts. He has a great history in the conservative movement, but more so as a gay activist. And you heard me right, gay activist in the conservative movement. We're going to hit on a lot of different things today. And he's also not just been outspoken, but he has even taken his battle all the way to the United States Supreme Court and has won. He has been a strong voice in the community and being able to stand up for conservative values. Marco, thank you for coming on today.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Let's just talk real quick about your 1985 U.S. Supreme Court. And, that was at Texas A&M, from my understanding. What all happened, and then what was the process?
Well, this was a court case that involved a group called Gay Student Services. And it started off with an intention of a group of students at A&M wanting to get together and have basically an ability to talk to each other and assist each other, because in those days, being a gay person was something that you really couldn't do openly. And this would be like, again, back in the 70s and 80s. But when they tried to advertise their meetings, they were prevented from doing so. And they were told that unless they were a recognized student organization, they weren't allowed to post any messages, even though other people were allowed to do it. So they said, okay, well, then we'll do that. Then we'll apply to be a formal group, which of course meant they had to get people to put their names down as folks. And they found 3 people willing to do it. And of course, it turned into a big deal because now the university did not want to recognize them. And they came up with all kinds of reasons to why not to do it. But the case eventually came down to the issue of the First Amendment. And so I became president of that organization as that court case was ongoing. And it became a very public item. I think, back in the mid 80s, this was big news in Texas. There weren't that many cases like this at the time. There were a few other cases similar around the country, but not in Texas. And people were watching this case because it was an issue about, can the state university decide who it will and will not recognize, even though it's taking the taxes from everyone. Ultimately, with a series of decisions that went first to the Fifth Circuit Court, and it went twice. It went up to the Supreme Court, kicked back down against the district court, and then made its way all back up again. Until finally, the Supreme Court on April 1st, 1985, let the Fifth Circuit Court ruling in favor of A&M stand, which now meant that A&M had to recognize these student services and its opinions about whether the group was a good group or a bad group, or that it was harmful or not harmful to society, was not relevant.
Wow. And you were a strong conservative.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because the irony of all of that is, while I was there and while I was doing this, I became aware of the fact that there was a very strong leftist, progressive, authoritarian presence within, the gay community. And while I was president, there was an attempt to turn Gay Student Services into this anti-patriarchal, very political group that would be demanding abortion rights and all kinds of things like that. I objected because I felt that this isn't about that. This is for any gay person that wants support. This is to provide roommate services, counseling services. We're not here to start talking about political issues. And so when I declined to go along with that, it became a real political battle. So at the same time that we were fighting with A&M on the one side for the right to be on campus, behind the scenes, I was fighting a second battle with very strong leftists in my organization that wanted to turn it into a very left-leaning, progressive agenda organization. And that is really what made me a conservative, when I felt like, no, this is not going to happen. And it turned into a year-long battle, which eventually I prevailed, but it was very eye-opening to me to see the lengths that people would go to in the name of freedom and helping people and non-discrimination to do some really ugly things.
For all the viewers out there, you're hearing a lot right now about gay conservative, and you may or may not know. I mean, before I really got involved and met you, I placed all gay people in with the LGBTQ in all of their agenda, mainly because they were It's the most broadcast, right? Like you say, a very far left, progressive, and they have an agenda and they came after it. But never did I think that there was people like you that were out there fighting the battle. And you've been doing this for a very long time. And
Yeah, I'm an old guy.
you know, and you've been the president and the state chair of the log cabin. You have done a lot of different work. And what I was most shocked about when I ran for office, you supported me in your organization. And I didn't know that there was conservative gays out there that would actually stand behind, number one, a Christian pastor. But you did. And what I learned was that you believed in a lot of things that I believe in. Now, we might not agree on some things, but I don't agree with a lot of people on some things either. However, I was really shocked when found out that you stood for against the transgenders, a story time with the drag queen, and the ideology that came along with that whole thing. And it worked when we talked about the HERO ordinance, which you were very involved in and very active during that time. And when I definitely want to dive into that. And it was a learning process for me to really just to comprehend and what I want. Wow. And then just to learn some of these fights that I was fighting, you were there, right there, fighting the same thing as a gay man and as a leader of a gay community. So let's just talk a little bit about that. Let's go back to 2015, I think it was, with the HERO ordinance. Marinice Parker, as we know, she came out with the HERO ordinance, and it sounds great. They always give these fancy titles, right? You hear the HERO ordinance, I'm thinking of police officers and I'm thinking of military personnel.
Right. HERO.
But it was an agenda behind that where they wanted to be able to take off labels on the restrooms and open up restrooms where people could go use whatever restroom you wanted at that whole ordeal, which I was strongly against. Because number one, I have daughters and it's wrong, and I don't want any man going into the restroom with my wife, with my kids, with my mom, or any of those things, right? There's a reason why we're separating, right? Because men need to be with men and women need to be with women. And so anyways, I learned that, we fought that, but give me a little bit of background on why you decided to go, because Marinice Parker was gay also, or she was lesbian. Right?
Yes.
And so, but you went against the grain. Why?
Well, the thing about this is, I had been watching this development of the, I again, as I got exposed to it, in college, and that's when I first became aware of this whole thought process from the left that really started with the women's studies programs, which then produced something called the gender studies programs, and it was an offshoot of that. And so I already got an introduction of what the ideology was during that year that I was dealing with these folks and trying to, as they presented their arguments, and I gave to understand what they were heading for. I will tell you, though, that back then I would not have predicted how successful they would be in what I thought would be pushing absurdity. But when the HERO ordinance came along, that's when I decided to get back involved with politics, because I really felt that conservatives were missing the boat, not understanding what they were facing, and that even many people who call themselves conservatives were supporting the ordinance. And it seemed to me like they don't understand or grasp what this is about. They're trying to be nice. They feel like this is an issue of discrimination, but it's not. And it's because the folks that pushed this forward, and that was, the business community was pushing it, of course, certainly the government was pushing it, and the media was pushing it. And it's one of the things people forget is that the pro-HERO folks outspent the anti-HERO folks 7-1, and just the amount of the money that was spent in the campaign. But when you actually read the ordinance, and I told people, you need to read what's in it, not just look at the beautiful title. Mm-hmm. It does something that it shouldn't be doing, which is pretending that there's no difference between male and female. And that is a consequence, not just for straight people, but for gay people too as well. A lot of folks don't understand that difference. I think we're beginning to see it now, and I think more gay people are waking up to what this means to them. I don't think that many people at the time understood it. But bottom line, it was in that ordinance, it basically penalized you and made it impossible for a, say, conservative Christian or a gay person who wasn't comfortable with this to say, I don't believe in this way of segregating the sexes, which is to go only by what somebody declares themselves. That's unenforceable. That's not practical. It's insane. It doesn't make any sense. And this idea of, well, we care about trans people, sure, but caring about trans people doesn't mean that you turn society upside down and make everything subservient to it.
Right.
And the example I often use to tell people about how this is not about being against anyone. We can have compassion with people who have different circumstances or issues to deal with that I may not understand. For example, some people who can't see, and that's a problem. Doesn't mean they're inferior. We don't mean that they're less than the rest of us. But we don't prevent everybody else from enjoying life able to see. We don't prevent movies because they can't be enjoyed from everyone. We try to accommodate. But what which is more properly called the gender ideology movement.
Right.
It's using the situation of a few individuals and hijacking it for the purposes of changing the way we think about sex, about sexuality, about marriage, all these things, and basically saying, if you don't agree with us, we're going to make it against the law for you to practice your beliefs in any way possible, or even talk about them.
Right.
By the time the HERO ordinance was already in play in Houston, already in Canada and in other cities across the country, it was illegal to even disagree with the idea that biology is a real thing. And in Canada, actually, it is already. So in Canada, you can actually be criminalized and be fined if you point out the biology of another person.
What?
And we're heading in that direction. One of the other things people don't realize, again, gay people not understanding it, but more are waking up. By then, already that ordinance, that type of ordinance was already in place in other cities in the country, very similar. And it actually was beginning to hurt gay people too. And one example is what happened in Denver to a gay bar. It was a case that happened in 2014, and this ordinance had been there before that. But what gay people often miss, liberal gay people miss, is that when you start putting these laws that are targeting businesses, the businesses that are most likely to be affected first are gay businesses. Why? Because the people that are aware of these laws and are going to enforce them are in your community. So your business will be the first one that will come under this scrutiny. And this is what happened to this bar. So about a year after this ordinance passed, which not many people knew about, but some people did, there was a bar that catered to a clientele that's obviously, it's a gay bar, so it was mostly male, right? But it had a dress code. It basically said, we don't like dresses. We're not about dresses or anything like that. So our dress code is you wear jeans and t-shirts, and we just don't allow people to come in dresses, right? You can be a woman if you want to, but you still have to dress in jeans and t-shirts. That's our dress code, right? Mm-hmm. Well, a guy wanted to come in a dress with a wig and the whole thing, makeup, and the bar said no. It became an issue, and ultimately the bar lost because the city said, no, according to this ordinance, you can't do that because you are promoting a false image of masculinity and saying that men can only be men and can't wear dresses. Of course, that wasn't the issue. The issue was the bar just had a clientele that it wanted to cater to. The bar went out of business. All those gay employees and the gay owner lost. He lost his business, and all the employees, many of them who can't find jobs elsewhere. I mean, a lot of folks, if you go to these bars, they're not going to be able to find jobs easily in another place. This is a place where they can work. They're gone. So I was aware of all of this already by then. So by 2015, I felt that you don't right wrongs by telling people that they don't have their own opinions and don't have a right to decide what they think about these topics. And that's what this ordinance was trying to do by using trans people as some sort of cover and saying, well, we're trying to help them. We're trying to help gay people. And that's another thing about the ordinances and the terminology about LGBT, trying to pretend that, T issues are the same as G issues. They're not. But you keep saying, well, if you don't support these kinds of bathroom arrangements, you're anti-gay. No, this has nothing to do with gay people. A lot of gay people don't like this idea at all. So yeah, I felt that HERO was definitely a big problem, but we did have a lot of gay people who were going for it because, again, they just saw
the whole thing.
They just saw the name.
Right.
They saw the name. This is to protect you. And we had a lot of people going on the news, on television, Eastern Chronicle, all saying this is to protect gay people. This is to protect you. And we had to make the case that it is not protecting. Having the state suppress people that don't agree with you is not protecting.
Right. Not at all. And I'll tell you, on the other side of the fence, obviously, we as Christians, all different denominations came together when I was involved in this. We had different meetings at different churches, and then we met at a big one was at Grace Community Church right on the street. And we sent Bibles into the mayor's office, all kinds of things, but we saw it as a personal attack, not just on our freedoms and liberties, but on Christian values. Because you're trying to take away, like you said, a man and female, which is, God created man and female, created for a reason. And outside of biblical stance that I took, I saw it as we're setting people up for failure. And what I mean by that is, we'll just talk about bar. An open bar with all different demographics of different people, color, whatever, everything. Gay, straight, come in the bar. Well, somebody's daughter, wife goes to the restaurant. Somebody had too much to drink. Somebody banging on the door tries to get in. It don't go well, it just ends bad to people. Or if you have a restaurant that has multiple stalls, and let's say, some females go in there and a guy finds one of them attractive, and he ends up, he's drunk, had too much drink, and he goes in there and he's trying to hit on her in there, and, her husband or brothers or whoever's out there. It just sets up a whole lot of different scenarios that is bad for business owners in the community overall. I think more so we'll see people act out in violence because of this issue or how they feel. If you think that if I got 3 daughters, if one of them goes to the restroom and I see a male follow them into the restroom, you think I'm just going to sit at my table, get up and go in there? You're out of your mind.
And Hero would have made you a criminal for stopping.
You see what I'm saying?
They would have done that. And I do think a lot of people did not quite grasp that.
I didn't know that.
It did. And it's funny because, I had a story from a gay person who serves on one of these, gay organizations in Houston. And this is after Hero finally was defeated. But there are some gay organizations. So, people may not realize that, but we don't actually have laws about this at all. It's just businesses do what they think is appropriate for their clientele. And just like you do at your church and everywhere else, right now, there is no law that governs this. So some of these gay institutions that are, most of them are left-leaning, did went ahead and adopted this new policy anyway. And this individual said he went to use the restroom and was shocked to find, a member of the opposite sex, because they had made their gender-neutral restrooms, and complained about it. And they pointed out to him that, well, you supported Hero. That's what Hero does. Had no clue. So this is one of the many people who voted for that and was wanting to support this thing, not grasping the reality of what this was. And of course, he was very uncomfortable with the whole situation. But beyond that, though, it's the issue of what are we talking about here? People get very defensive of having to explain why it's okay to have separate, facilities by biology. But if you'll notice, the gender ideology folks who are pushing all this, they're not saying eliminate the 2 separations. They're just saying change the way you discriminate. So they're not saying don't discriminate. They're saying change the discernment from biology to pronoun use. And then summarize.
Going out. Here real quick, I want to stop you real quick, because you said something so important a minute ago. But, for the church, the Meredith Parker subpoenaed, the one that subpoenaed our sermons, because of what you're saying is, if you're going to discriminate, there's other ways to discriminate when you go against biology, where our Bible says he created man and woman. Difference. And so by subpoena in our sermons, are we creating hate speech is what they're...
It's another thing. Absolutely. It was outrageous. I heard about that. And I again, it only strengthened my fervor, because I'm a very strong free speech advocate, I've always felt that it doesn't matter whose opinion it is. If the state, and I will say this to my dear friends, if the state has the power to silence Christians, then it can silence anyone, and that's you included. So if we were being silenced before, and we were able to get through that, that's actually because a lot of Christians were okay. They understood the principle. When I was in college, back to that thing, one of the things that was very eye-opening to me was how many Christians would tell me, not all, but many, who would say, look, I don't agree with your stance, but I do believe in the Constitution, and I do believe in freedom of speech, and I do think you have the right to speak. And I really valued that, because that to me is a person of principle who says, I understand what a principle is. I don't apply it only when I like it and only when it benefits me personally. I apply it as a rule of life, or ethics, that everybody gets to enjoy the same rule the same way. And that's the key thing to get to people. So this issue of discrimination was going on. It's like, you guys are basically saying that people do not have the right to disagree with you on this.
Right.
They have no right to tell you that biology has it's a more relevant way of distinguishing people. You're trying to criminalize that. I challenge us, why don't we just have a debate over this? Why don't you explain to us why we should be changing from biology to pronoun identification? Let's have that debate, because you're saying we need to switch it. You keep saying non-discrimination, that's not true. That's a false argument. So when they say we're trying to eliminate discrimination, that's false. You're not doing that. You're saying you're wanting to change the terms.
Right.
And that's what we should have argument about that, and say, okay, if you want to change the term, if you want to say that we should think about male and female based on pronoun use, why is that better? Tell us how that makes sense.
And there's been a big movement since then. 2018, that's when I got more involved with the story time with the drag queen. I went up and spoke on that several times with Mayor Turner. Now Mayor Turner was in office at that time. I was against it. Went out. I've contacted the library multiple times trying to get books that I would physically go up there do, and they would not order it. All these things I could go on and on and on. I don't want to get into all that. But you were against it as well. So the whole story time with the drag queen and the ideology, because here's the thing. There's one thing to be transgender, it's a whole other thing to try to push on children. And bring an ideology amongst it. And then now you're going so further with the pronouns. In my heart goes out to the trans community. I've learned a lot about it because I've gone to the state capitol. I've testified on multiple bills. I can go on and on and on about that. And I've learned a lot about the suicide rate transgenders. I've learned a lot about just mentally what they've gone through, bullying and everything. And it's a struggle for identity is how I see it. And I don't know what their home life is like. I don't know, any of that. And all that plays a factor into it. But in my years past, I put you, and I say you, I didn't know you at the time, but all gay people in that whole umbrella with trans in 2018 and on. But it blew me away to find out that you were against it as well. You invited me out, you and your group at the time that you were in was called the Log Cabin. And I was nervous, and I talked to you, I was like, oh, I stood against this, and then she's like, okay, I did too, we did too. And I was like, what? Wait a minute. You're against that? Like, yeah, man. I was like,
yeah, so I wasn't, so Log Cabin at the time had to go through a change because Log Cabin Houston at the time did endorse Hero. That's just a fact. I opposed it at the time, even though I was on that board. When I became as president in 2016, before I became president, I made it very clear that if I became president, there would be changes, and started explaining to people why. Because again, I felt a lot of people were supporting it, not understanding what it really did. They were just thinking it in these, it's pro-gay. That's all they understood, and that's what we're doing. A lot of Republicans do the same thing. One of the reasons why we've had such a difficult time at the legislature in previous sessions, not this one so much, but in previous sessions, there's many Republicans, conservatives even, well-meaning people. They want to be compassionate. They want to be understanding, and then they don't want to discriminate. And so they just kind of in a sort of knee-jerk reaction to support these things when you need to say to them, no, that's not actually helpful. It may seem that way at the surface. It may look that way, but it's not. I mean, Charlie Baker is a governor of Massachusetts, Republican, and he is pushing these kinds of things. Other Republicans are doing it too. And you ask yourself, well, why is that? And that's because they don't really grasp what's really involved in these things. And I like the way you pointed out about the compassion for the trans people, because this is, again, it's not against being against anyone, not including trans people. Certainly there are individuals who experience, just like I can sympathize with that, circumstances that the rest of us cannot fully understand or explain, and they should be, allowed to live their lives without being harassed. And, we can have our opinions about what they're doing, but certainly they should be persecuted, hounded from their jobs or whatever those things are. But again, it doesn't mean that you now turn society upside down and say that anyone who doesn't validate that lifestyle can't have a business, can't make decisions for themselves on how their lives are going to be led, can't speak about it. That can't be allowed. And that's what's happened with the situation. And it's interesting you mentioned about Anise Parker, because one of the things I remember about that campaign is she kept saying this line: this is what the people want. I'm representing the people. People want this ordinance. At the same time that she was fighting tooth and nail the referendum so we could find out what people actually think about this. And one of the other things and why Log Cabin did in fact change, I would say that election in fact allowed Log Cabin in Houston and later Texas to drop this, was the way their election went. And as you remember, Houston is not by any means a far-right city. It had a gay mayor elected 3 times in a row. And in that same election in 2015, where, a liberal black mayor was elected, it voted down this ordinance 2-1, almost. Even though so you couldn't say it was a hostile city. You couldn't say it was, when it was a red wave, because it wasn't. And you couldn't say, well, they didn't get the message out. No, well, they had 7 times as much money as the opponents. So clearly the people did not want this. Enough people got that. They figured there's something about this ordinance that doesn't make any sense. And that did wake up some people at Log Cabin to realize that, okay, maybe this isn't the way to go. And we started pushing the freedom first idea, that the way to defend liberty and fair treatment for everybody, it isn't to just argue for yourself, but it's to argue for everyone. It's not about being pro-LGBT. It's about being fair with the First Amendment. It's about protecting people's property rights, about making sure that, people can't use their personal beliefs as a cudgel against another human being. Those things. And then if you talk that way, guess what? A lot of Christians are for that. They're going, if you're talking about fairness, I'm all for that. I just don't want to sign up and say, I support some things that in my conscience are not consistent with my Christian values.
I love that you said that, because in this legislation, we had we passed the Chapman bill, which I went up and testified. Senator Middleton drafted up that bill, and I went and testified on it multiple times. And in the Christian community, like, oh yeah, Chapman bill. But what I told the Christian community is, this isn't for the Christian community. This is for all communities. But if the Christians don't step up, then we fail.
That's right.
So, and they were like, what? And I was like, listen to me. This Chapman bill is opened up for all people of denominations. You can say it's a victory for the Christian community. I do, because I plan on getting chaplains into some schools. However, if we don't do it as a Christian community, then we fail. We can let the Muslims, the Buddhists, we can let whoever wants to be, well, they got to go through severe process of becoming a chaplain, meeting first everywhere. They go through an intense background checks, and they have to have all the schools and stuff. But at the end of the day, if Christians don't do it, and I can speak to Christians because I'm Christian and I'm a pastor, but if we don't do that, then we fail. Then this bill was for nothing, and we basically give it over to whoever. But it's for all people is where I'm going. It's for all denominations and all people of whatever. It's who's going to step up to the plate. Our freedoms, you know, I was in the military. My unit, we got orders to go to Iraq on and other stuff. You know, we fought for our brothers next to us. We stand on the American freedoms. We live in Houston, you and I, where we have all different shades of people, many different languages, all the languages of the world, what I tell people, because we have the World Medical Center, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can go down there any time of day and just walk down Fannin and probably hear different languages at lunchtime, right? We have all these different restaurants, all these wonderful different flavors of the world that come to our city, and people that don't believe like that. But one thing that we can all agree is that we all enjoy freedoms and the liberties that we love so much to be able to say, I want to go eat at a Mexican restaurant like this, or I want to go eat at a Fridays, TGI Fridays, and not get discriminated against. Or I want to go to Kelly Country's Cooking, or I want to go to Cracker Barrel as a Hispanic, or as a Black person, or as an Asian person, and no one is winning our language too, because why are you eating other people's food? Something silly to think about like that, but it's the reality. And I try to dumb that down. There's other major issues that we can definitely go into, but our freedoms that many have fought for on our land, since George Washington and on, fought for all of us to have equal rights and equalities. In fact, we talk about Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King, Reverend King is what I like to call him. He did great for the civil rights movement, right? A lot of people don't realize that he fought for all races.
Yes, and I think his rhetoric definitely was very clear about that.
Yeah, but people don't even realize. I mean, he said it in multiple speeches about the Hispanics. Really, a lot of Latinos don't realize that it was blacks on the signs and no blacks, dogs, Mexicans, or Latinos on the signs. But yet, if it wasn't for the man Martin Luther King for really taking on the stance of freedoms that you fought in 1985, going forward and paving the way, saying, hey, hold on, we have a constitution, right? And in that constitution defines what we stand on as a nation. And I think that's what makes our country so beautiful. Because we can have a lot of, I don't want to live in a community, and I say this all the time, especially about church. I don't want to go to all Latino church. I just don't. I love our church because it is people of all different colors. I think we did a survey one time, and we had, I believe, 23 or 25 different ethnicities here. And we had like 17 languages or 15 languages, something like that. Something crazy.
Right.
But it blew my mind. And that's what I want to be part of. My kids go to a school, and I get it, not everybody has that opportunity, but my kids go to schools where there's a lot of different cultures. And again, we have, me and you, we live in the city of Houston where we have that. We could choose to go eat seafood today. We can, you could choose to go eat lunch with a straight guy.
Well, and by the same token, by you saying that, we also allow, so we have spaces where multiple ethnicities and communities come together. But we also have the spaces where each culture can also, insert itself in its own way. Whether that be in a business, for example, a Jewish deli, right? We talk about discrimination and freedom of speech. And one of the ways that the left has used discrimination and civil rights as a way to try to subvert the Constitution has been with this whole word discrimination and what that means. And so I try to tell people, explain it to them to make sure that doesn't happen to them, right? Why is it that so many people are giving into this? And when they're clearly infringing on that freedom of speech, which also includes religious freedom, right? That religious liberty. And What it has to do with this thing you mentioned about being able to walk into any restaurant in Guam and not being discriminated against. And I always tell people, make sure that when you talk about discrimination, you talk about illegal and unfair. And they say, well, Marco, is it all of it unfair? I said, no, it's not. We discriminate between men and women as male and female. And that's not wrong. Actually, the Civil Rights Act that talks about public accommodations like hotels and restaurants, the ones you use to get into a restaurant, doesn't actually mention sex. It mentions ethnicity, race, religion, nationality, but it does not mention that because it wasn't thought that that was necessary for that part. It is mentioned, say, for employment, things like that. And it's mentioned in Title IX of the Education Act about sports, which is interesting because that whole law, the purpose of it was to, quote, discriminate, segregate between male and female in sports so that women would be able to have their own track. Basically saying, we do not allow this for separate race-based sports. We don't have religion-based separation in sports. We don't do this anywhere else, but we do allow it for the sexes. Why? There's a reason for that. And the irony is that they're turning that inside out to say this law that was meant specifically for that purpose, no, that's actually against it, and you have to do it by someone's pronoun. And I point out, well, then if that was the case, if identity was the way you separate, then why can't we have a separation by self-identification by religion or other things? We don't, for a very good reason. So to touch on this whole thing about discrimination, freedom of speech, and our freedoms, then some of my friends will say, well, Marco, you're saying that they can deny us access because you're saying that these ordinances about baking cakes shouldn't be allowed. And my answer back to them is, that's not what I'm saying. Think of it this way. According to the Civil Rights Act, especially with this new interpretation that just came from the Supreme Court last year, you and I can go and buy a ticket to see a movie, because movies are covered in the Civil Rights Act. But you know what's not covered in the Civil Rights Act? Wedding cakes. But people don't know that. But there's an important part about the Civil Rights Act that most Americans, including Republicans, do not understand. The original Civil Rights Act, and it still is that way today, at no time does it require any individual to create a custom product or service that goes against their conscience. It doesn't. What it does, it says, we're in a hotel room. Sell me a pizza. Give me hospital care. Sell me gas. Do you know that you can do all those things without knowing whether the person's Muslim or not or anything? Not at one point do you have to know anything about that person or support their values. But that's different when you start saying, okay, now cater my Nazi event. Oh, well, hold on a second. That's not in the Constitution. A Jewish printer doesn't have to print Nazi flyers if he doesn't want to. Jewish deli does not have to cater a Muslim wedding because guess what? Their kitchen isn't even set up for that. It's kosher, not halal. They can't do that. So these laws would actually start making these businesses impossible because they do have to discriminate on the basis of what their religion allows. So it's a very key item for people to understand that when you talk about discrimination, we need to make sure that we're talking about unfair and illegal discrimination, and that always comes under the other rule, which is the Constitution about freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And I always tell, we have a hierarchy here. And the hierarchy is, number one rule is everyone gets to speak. And then all else, we can argue about the rest of it. But that rule has to be maintained. And the moment people start using these civil rights laws as a way to undo the First Amendment, which is what they're doing, which is what HERO was, basically trying to do that, is we have to be alert to that and start pointing out and saying, but what you're doing here is subverting the First Amendment, religious freedom, freedom of conscience, my right to make my own decisions. You're trying to stop that. And we've got to be better at pointing that out. And so that people who are sympathetic to trans can understand that it's not about being against anyone. It's about protecting everyone's rights, including the trans, to be able to say, I don't agree with this.
Oh, that's good. And again, when I talked about the transgender, we went and I spoke on the gender modification. I testified.
This is the one for children, right?
For the children, right? And I don't know if you know this or not, about this year and a couple of years ago, we've been doing this for a little bit and testifying for bills on trans, different things for trans. And so one was Save Legal Sports. I don't know if you remember that bill, testified against that several times.
You're talking about this session? Or
No,
last
the last session. I know we're going to collegiate level this year, but I'm talking about the high school K.
Yes, you know, and I was there as well as testifying in support of.
I do remember seeing you.
Yeah,
Yep,
over there.
Their testimony. And I'll tell you real quick. When I testified, the guy who testified before me, he was a trans man.
So that would be female to male.
He was male to female.
Well, if it's trans man, it would be female to male.
Okay. So he was transgender.
So, all right.
No, I understand what you're saying, but he was a man dressed as a female, but he's 6'4", 6'4", 6'5".
Okay.
He had to be about 260, 280. I'm just ripped. I mean, big old. And you know, he went up calling himself a pastor or a priest, whatever he was. You know, who talked about the equality and everyone should be able to play sports and things like that. And the whole time he's talking, I'm thinking, my goodness, you know, if he decided to be a wrestler and women's sports or whatever it may be, like he's gonna crush it. And I went up there and spoke, and I was like, well, I mean, and I'm not a little man. That guy made me look extremely little. And so, I mean, I don't think they should have never let him testify is what they should have done. But right after that, the state the state championship wrestling here in Texas came out where the transgender ended up crushing the girl's skull and the rest, which obviously was a big push, and we were able to win that, which I was completely against. You know, women shouldn't be playing in men's sports. Listen, by the time you're in high school, men go through a big growth spurt from 15 to 18 years old. I mean, I dropped off my son at ninth grade for ninth grade football, and some of these kids that are in ninth grade are well bigger than me. I'm 220, 225, 5'10". These kids are bigger in ninth grade. Can you imagine how big they are by their senior year? And yet you're going to want your daughter to play with these guys? You're crazy. But outside of that, we did the modification bill that was this year. And I don't know if you saw, but I took a group up there, and we decided to do a worship in the middle of the time, and just small worship set, like nothing crazy, nothing big. We ended up being surrounded by the trans community, and they're spitting on us, yelling, screaming, everything you can think about. And I mean, there was hundreds of people. That's right. In fact, the DPS officers had to escort us out. We stayed there for an hour. A lot of them ended up getting arrested. I mean, I don't know if you saw how they acted.
I did saw the videos and stuff. It was pretty awful.
Yeah, and you know, and here's what I'll tell you. If you want to be trans, but leave the kids alone. You start giving them a medication to alter their hormones. Kids have a difficult time in becoming who they are when they start to deal with hormones. Junior high, high school, you know, and how many of us change over that time period or even into our 20s and 30s? Hormones, blockers, or, you know, more testosterone or estrogen blockers, or all these other different medications really can mess up a child or even a person in general. Let's just take it for instance. I'm in my 40s, and some men struggle with testosterone levels in their mid-30s or in their younger 30s or maybe their whole life. And they get into 40s, they tell you to start getting checked, and then, you know, those. And so I had mine tested, and mine was still above average. Now, I have above average testosterone. That doesn't mean everybody does. It has to deal with our biological hormones, right? It's just who we are as the Creator created us. But to think that, you know, and I know several men that suffer from low T, and they get medication and shots, and I see what it deals with them, how they deal with, and these are grown men that struggle because they lack testosterone. But now a young child or a young boy that is coming up that's supposed to be producing testosterone for their natural body to grow and to feel however they're going to feel is now being blocked, which I think is completely wrong.
Well, the reality, of course, and I don't know if you know this, but the basis, the medical basis, scientific basis for recommending transitioning of children is almost non-existent. There's a study that was cited and has been used by activists here in the United States, and it was used in Europe also, a Dutch study. But when you look at the study, the conclusions are very flimsy. It was a very small group of people. And most scientists today agree that this is not enough to justify what they've been doing worldwide or attempting to do. And particularly now that we now are seeing more and more negative results and consequences from the use of hormone blockers on kids. But there's a couple of things going on here, which just kind of I get this issue can get very complicated and very messy very early on. But before I get to that, I just want to say one thing about those people at the Capitol. It's worth noting that not all trans people, particularly true transsexuals, I mean, we're talking about there's a difference between people who just want to wear a dress, and people who actually have a whole deep-seated dysphoria that they've experienced their whole life. This whole thing is getting muddier and muddier with these new changes. A lot of the people are straight. They're left progressives. And I can tell you a lot of people that are in this movement are not trans at all and have nothing to do with it. But they're some of the most ardent advocates for this particular ideology. That's why I call it an ideology. It's a very strong, almost a cultist mentality. So what has happened, though, in the last year and a half, scientific bodies around the world have started to pull back. And I don't know if you saw that. Sweden, United Kingdom, Norway, Finland, they're all saying, hold on, we're seeing some problems here. And we're beginning to notice that these study from the Dutch wasn't actually that good of a study as we thought it was, or as it had been presented. The strange thing is that these Western countries have already pretty much halted all child transition except under the experimental observation status, and that there's very few of us. I mean, we're talking single digits. So it's pretty much stopped across in Western Europe, not here in the United States. In the United States, we still have the same people still saying the studies show. They don't show that. And there's one study that they often say, studies show that if you don't give kids puberty blockers and do this, that the risk of committing suicide goes up. There is no such actual scientific study that says it. What they rely on is something that comes from the Trevor Project, which isn't really a study. It's simply a site where people can self-report. Well, anybody can tell you, any scientist will tell you that self-reporting studies are not very, very valid at all because the person can say anything. Right. And you're not really evaluating where they're coming from, what the condition was at all. So we really don't know the situation at core. But what we do know is that puberty blockers affect your body, and they can make you infertile, and they can lead to osteoporosis and all kinds of problems. And the other reason why the gender ideology movement is really having difficulty now more, and why I think this last session there was more pushback than there had been before. It may not seem that way, but believe me, compared to there's a lot more people willing to say stop, right? But the reason is because they've been so successful. Because they've been so successful in pushing this, we're now seeing a bunch of people saying, this was a mistake. They convinced me to do it. And guess who are the people most likely to be led into puberty blockers, cutting up body parts, becoming dependent for life on medical sustenance? Gay people. Gay kids. And that's why a lot of gay people are beginning to notice that, wait a second, you're saying that because your boy at 3 thought was having fun wearing dresses that you need to now put them on a transition path? I was a boy that did that, and I'm happy as a gay man. I shudder to think what it would have been. I'm saying rhetorically, but but there's a lot of gays who are thinking this process and saying, the reasons you're giving for doing this to kids are things that could have applied to me, and where would I be today? Because most of us do not feel that we needed to go through this. No. And a lot of these transitioners, people who are now testifying, saying you need to stop, is no one explains to them the reality of what it is to transition. The fact that you will forever and ever be dependent on constant medical intervention. Every day of your life, you're going to have to those hormones.
Yep.
And they cause problems with your body because your body isn't. This isn't to say that there isn't some person who experiences deep-seated gender dysphoria for whom this is worth it. Maybe, right? But that's a serious call. But what they're doing today is lying to these kids. They're lying to them literally in schools with certain programs that come from the Human Rights Campaign called the Welcoming Schools Initiative. And they basically tell them, you can be whatever you can be, and, never telling them, but there's a real price for this. And there was a very poignant, unsurprising episode in 60 Minutes. I don't know if you saw this, with Leslie Stahl.
No.
And it was about these kids. They interviewed a few. Of course, it caused such a furor that they've now taken off the description of the episode dealing with the transitioners, because a lot of the trans community or the gender ideology community were so angry about it. So it's still there if you can find it. But basically, they interviewed these young individuals who had gone through transition and now regretted it, and talking about their stories and how sad they are, how upset they are of what their life will never be the same. They can't have kids. But I was particularly moved by the testimony of this young man who had been convinced to remove his testicles. And he said, I'm just never going to get that back. And he said something along those lines, I will just never be able to restore myself. And he was about to cry into tears, and I'm going, this is what's the reality of what's happening. And so we have to be very firm that no matter what someone tells you, you have to say what you say. A child cannot make this call.
Right.
Plain and simple.
Cannot.
All there is.
Do you feel like there has been a, like in that arena, do you feel like it was an attack almost on gay kids?
No, although in Iran they do it that way. That's the irony. In Iran, if they think a kid is gay, they will. That's why Iran is one of these places where transition surgeries are not that unusual, which is ironic, right? Mm-hmm. It's this Muslim country. But it's because in their thought process, they don't want that to exist. So better the appearance that everybody is the other way, even if they're infertile. Doesn't matter. They don't care about that. I don't know how frequent that happens, but I have heard that it is more common there for that particular reason. Here in the United States, though, it really does come from an ideological premise. And again, it goes back to these gender studies. There's whole books written on this. And Christianity, yes, is an obstacle to them. So again, to people, whether they're pro-Christian or not, I'm going, that's irrelevant. Christians right now, first of all, are like everybody else. There's a lot of variety on how Christians look at this. But they are really the last defense. If Christians cannot fight this back, because they're the largest group, the biggest group, the strongest group, then the rest of us have no hope. And so you may not like what some of these Christians say, but if they're fighting for their speech, for freedom of religious liberty, that actually helps all of us. And you have to be more cognizant of that instead of worried about whether you like that particular Christian or not. Just in the same way, you don't think that some people should judge you just because you're gay, and you don't like that when they do that, right? You want them to take you at your word, then you should do the same thing.
Wow, I hope you guys just heard that. That's coming from a gay man saying that the Christians have the strongest voice and largest group, and that we have to be engaged to fight this thing. Well, a lot of Christians sit on the sideline and do nothing, but complain. They're great at complaining. But we need Christians to get into the fight. We need Christians to go to the polls. We need Christians to vote. We need Christians to rise up and run for office, and just be more vocal and stand up and get into this fight. Real quick, you're a gay man. You've been outspoken since the 80s. You've taken a court case in your organization, you're president, all the way to the United States Supreme Court and won. Are you pro-life?
You mean like if you're talking about abortion?
Yeah.
I would describe that generally, yes, I would fall into the pro-life category.
Are you for religious freedoms?
Well, that's what I do. And, the new organization that I represent, the Texas Conservative Liberty Forum, that is part of our founding mission, is to protect First Amendment rights. And so religious liberty is definitely one of my key elements. And again, I do that. First of all, I do consider myself a Christian. I know some people may not because I'm gay, but I do.
I would love to discuss that how much time we got? Oh, we're done. I'm gonna have to bring you back on that because, and I don't mean, I know we're gonna have to edit this or some of this out, but here's what I'd say. We have this whole group section. You see this last row right here? Mm-hmm. That whole row right here on the left, all from the first seat all the way back. Mm-hmm. We have a drug and alcohol treatment facility, and that they come to church here, right? They come with a lot of different baggages that they've battled their whole life. And, the Bible talks about the drunkards, the liars, talks about the homosexuals, talks about, I can list, we know what scriptures will go to. Mm. Doesn't mean that they're not Christian. Doesn't mean you're not. So that's
I appreciate that.